The mockery over her ripped jacket was a low, constant hum at forward operating base kestrel, a background noise she had learned to filter out. It was a flimsy thing, a civilian shell against the abrasive desert wind, its sleeve torn in a jagged line from wrist to elbow. But Captain Eva Rostova knew that in a place like this, symbols mattered more than substance. To the other officers, the tear was a mark of carelessness, of a career in freefall. They saw a disgraced logistics officer, not the ghost who had once haunted the world's forgotten conflicts. Soon, they would see her in different gear, and the mockery would die in their throats. Part 1. Arrival. The C-130's ramp lowered with a hydraulic groan, spitting a handful of personnel into the shimmering heat of the Afghan highlands. Eva Rostova was the last one off, her boots sinking into the fine, talcum-like dust that covered everything at FOB Kestrel. She carried a single duffel bag and wore the jacket, a faded olive-drab thing that offered little protection from the biting wind that swept down from the surrounding peaks. The wind caught the frayed edges of the tear on her left sleeve, making them flutter like a tattered flag of surrender. She felt the eyes on her immediately. The ground crew, the board guards in the perimeter towers, the pair of lieutenants loitering near the operations center. They all saw the same thing. A lone captain, unescorted, wearing civilian attire that looked like it had been through a shredder. It was an anomaly in a world built on uniformity and immaculate presentation. Her orders were simple. Report to the base commander, Colonel Madsen. The walk to the command post was a study in controlled observation. Her gait was steady, economical, betraying none of the weariness from the 20-hour journey. But her eyes missed nothing. She noted the placement of the HESCO barriers, the fields of fire for the 50-caliber machine gun nests, the way the perimeter fence sagged slightly in the northwestern quadrant. She saw the complacency in the way a private leaned against a sandbag, his helmet tilted back, his focus on a crumpled magazine instead of the barren ridges that loomed over them. Most critically, from the slight dip in the terrain and the angle of the nearest sensor tower, she identified a potential dead zone in the electronic surveillance grid, a narrow corridor of vulnerability. Colonel Madsen's office was an island of rigid order in the sea of dust and chaos. His desk was clear, his uniform was starched to the point of being a fire hazard, and his gaze was as sharp and unforgiving as a shard of ice. He was a man who had built his career on regulations, a man who believed the Army's strength lay in its unwavering adherence to protocol. He didn't invite her to sit. He took her file, his eyes flicking over the single, heavily redacted page of her transfer orders, then landing on her. His lip curled slightly as he took in a jacket. "Captain Rostova," he said, his voice flat. "I was told to expect a logistics officer. I run a tight ship here. My officers are expected to maintain a professional appearance. That thing," he gestured vaguely at her jacket, "is not part of any uniform I recognize." The dismissal was plain. He wasn't just commenting on her attire. He was questioning her very presence, her right to wear the rank on her collar. Eva's face remained a placid mask. She had endured the condescension of men like Madsen before. They saw the world in black and white, in regulations and reports. They couldn't comprehend the shades of gray where she had lived her entire adult life. "It gets cold during the transit, sir," she replied, her voice even and low, carrying no hint of defiance or excuse. Madsen grunted, unimpressed. "See the quartermaster. Get yourself a proper fleece. You'll be overseeing inventory at Supply Depot 4. Major Davies will give you the rundown. Don't be a disappointment." It was a clear dismissal. As she turned to leave, her eyes drifted past him to the large tactical map on his wall. From his window, she could see the entire northwestern perimeter. Her earlier observation was confirmed. The dead zone was real, a subtle flaw in an otherwise robust defense. A flaw that a competent enemy would exploit. A flaw that Colonel Madsen, a man who saw only what was on the surface, had clearly missed. She held his gaze for a fraction of a second, her own eyes betraying nothing, then gave a crisp nod. "Yes, sir." Part 2, Dismissal. Supply Depot 4 was a purgatory of cardboard boxes and metal shelving, smelling of dust, canvas, and machine oil. It was where equipment came to die or be forgotten. Assigning her here was a calculated insult, a bureaucratic exile designed to keep her out of sight and out of mind. Major Davies, a portly man whose greatest daily battle was against the buttons on his shirt, gave her a perfunctory tour. He spoke with the slow, condescending drawl of someone explaining a simple task to a child. "The system is all digitized, of course," he explained, tapping a key on a ruggedized laptop with a greasy finger. "Requisitions come in here. You check them against inventory here. You sign off here. Even a captain should be able to handle it." He chuckled at his own weak joke. Eva just listened, her expression unreadable. She nodded in all the right places, her mind already cataloging the depot's contents far more efficiently than the sluggish computer system ever could. She saw not just boxes of MREs and spare vehicle parts, but assets. She noted the crates of C4 demolition charges logged as engineering supplies, the half-dozen advanced thermal optics mislabeled as night vision, obsolete, and the collection of non-standard encrypted radios gathering dust in a locked cage. These were tools, and her mind, a finely honed weapon itself, instinctively understood their potential applications. The mockery that had begun in the colonel's office followed her. As she left the command post earlier, 2 lieutenants had fallen in behind her, their voices just loud enough to carry. "Did you see that jacket? Looks like she got in a fight with a lawnmower and lost." Their laughter was sharp and cruel. Now, in the depot, the enlisted personnel gave her a wide berth. They had heard the whispers. The new logistics captain was a screw-up, a reject from a real unit, sent to Kestrel to be forgotten. The torn jacket was the proof. She spent her first full day in the depot, not just learning the system, but mastering the physical space. She moved with a silent, purposeful grace that seemed out of place among the clatter and grime. She reorganized shelves, not for neatness, but for tactical access. The medical supplies were moved closer to the main door, the ammunition further back behind a secondary set of reinforced barriers. She calibrated the depot's fire suppression system herself, noting its pressure levels and coverage arcs. While her hands worked, her mind drifted. She felt the ghost pains of old wounds, the echo of a rifle's weight against her shoulder, the familiar tension of a mission deep behind enemy lines. This placid world of inventory sheets and forklift schedules was alien to her. The quiet was more unnerving than the scream of incoming fire. It was a silence that bred complacency, and complacency was a killer. Later that evening, she bypassed the officer's mess, instead taking a ration pack back to her small, sterile room. She sat on the edge of her cot, the torn jacket resting beside her. She ran her fingers along the frayed seam. It wasn't a mark of failure. It was a reminder of a fall from a rooftop in Mosul, of dragging her wounded teammate to safety under a hail of gunfire. The fabric had snagged on twisted rebar, tearing as she shielded him with her own body. The jacket was a memorial, a private testament to a cost Madsen and his polished lieutenants could never comprehend. It was a piece of her history, and she wasn't ready to let it go. Putting it on, she felt the familiar weight settle on her shoulders. It was a poor substitute for body armor, but for now, it was the only armor she had. Part 3. Observation. In the days that followed, Eva Rostova became a phantom. She performed her logistics duties with a chilling efficiency that left Major Davies both impressed and unsettled. But the moment her required tasks were done, she would vanish into the fabric of the base. She didn't socialize. She didn't linger. She observed. Her movements were disciplined, her path a series of straight lines and sharp angles that always kept her back to a wall. She spent hours in the communications tent, ostensibly checking on the inventory of spare parts. But her real focus was on the flow of information. She watched a young specialist, Corporal Jean, a quiet, sharp-eyed man who moved with an economy of motion that hinted at an intelligence beyond his rank. She noted the frequencies he monitored, the encryption protocols he used, and the subtle tells in his posture when a signal was weak or anomalous. She would walk the perimeter at dusk, the time when shadows grew long and guards were at their most fatigued. She followed the patrol routes, memorizing their timing down to the second. She saw the patterns of complacency, the guards who would cluster together to talk, the one who always lit a cigarette in the same spot, turning his back on the vast, threatening expanse of the mountains for a full 90 seconds. She measured distances with her eyes, calculating fields of fire, dead angles, and the time it would take a determined attacker to cross the open ground between the outer fence and the inner barracks. In the base's small intelligence section, she'd request topographical maps of the surrounding province under the pretext of planning convoy routes. The intel sergeant, a man named Griggs, would roll his eyes at the supply captain playing soldier, but he'd give her the maps. She would spend an hour poring over them, her fingers tracing the contour lines, her mind building a three-dimensional model of the battle space. She memorized ingress and egress routes, identified natural choke points, and noted every cave, ravine, and rock outcropping that could provide cover or concealment for an enemy force. Her inner world was a constant stream of tactical analysis, a stark contrast to her calm, almost vacant exterior. Wind speed is 15 knots, gusting to 25 from the northwest. Dust storm probable by 1600 hours. Visibility will drop to near zero. Perfect for infiltration. The main generator has a distinct thermal signature, easily targeted. The fuel depot is located just 50 meters from it. A critical vulnerability. Chain of command is rigid. Madsen is the single point of failure. If the CP is hit, decision-making will collapse. This silent, relentless assessment was a reflex, as natural to her as breathing. It was the survival mechanism that had kept her alive in places that didn't appear on any official maps. The other officers saw her as a ghost, a quiet failure haunting the edges of their well-ordered world. They mistook her silence for weakness, her observation for aimlessness. Corporal Jean was perhaps the only one who saw something different. He noticed her in the comms tent, saw the way her eyes weren't on the inventory lists but on the spectrum analyzer, her head tilting slightly as if listening to a conversation no one else could hear. He saw the intelligence in her stillness. He didn't know what she was, but he knew she was not just a logistics officer. And he watched her as intently as she watched everyone else. Part 4. Pressure. The pressure began not with a bang, but with a hiss. It started as static on the long-range radio, a crackle that gradually swallowed every frequency. Within 10 minutes, every channel was a wall of white noise. The satellite link, the base's lifeline to CENTCOM, flickered and died, its screen dissolving into a pixelated mess. The local comms net, used for coordinating patrols and perimeter guards, went down next. FOB Kestrel was deaf and blind. A nervous energy, sharp and acidic, filled the command post. Colonel Madsen stood in the center of the room, his face a mask of controlled fury. His immaculate uniform seemed to mock the chaos erupting around him. "What is it?" he barked at his comms officer, a young captain named Rourke. "I don't know, sir," Rourke stammered, frantically cycling through frequencies. "It's not atmospheric. It's a blanket jam. Military grade. It's sophisticated. Too sophisticated for local insurgents." The implications hung heavy in the air. This wasn't the work of goat herders with rusty Kalashnikovs. This was a professional enemy, an enemy who knew precisely how to isolate them. Panic, once a simmer, began to boil. Specialists hunched over their consoles, their faces illuminated by the green glow of useless data streams. They ran diagnostics, rebooted systems, and shouted jargon at one another, but the result was the same: silence. The base, once a node in a vast military network, had been reduced to an isolated island in a sea of hostile territory. Madsen's voice grew tighter, sharper. "Find a source. I want that jammer located and neutralized 10 minutes ago." But they couldn't. The jamming signal was too powerful, too clean. It wasn't emanating from a single point. It seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. A masterful application of electronic warfare that baffled Madsen's highly trained but inexperienced team. They were used to following protocols, to running established plays from the Army's handbook. This was off script. Outside the command post, the mood on the base soured. Without comms, the guards in the towers felt exposed. Patrols that were outside the wire were now completely cut off. The illusion of safety provided by technology had been stripped away, leaving behind the cold, hard reality of their vulnerability. The wind howled, kicking up dust that swirled through the camp, adding to the sense of claustrophobia and dread. In the midst of the rising hysteria, Eva Rostova remained an island of calm. She had been in Supply Depot 4 when the comms went down. She felt it more than she heard it, a sudden absence, a void where the constant chatter of the base's electronic nervous system used to be. She finished logging a crate of medical supplies, secured the depot, and began walking towards the command post. Her pace was unhurried, her expression unchanged. She had seen this before. This was a classic opening move. The electronic decapitation. The real attack was yet to come. The pressure didn't faze her, it focused her. For the first time since arriving at FOB Kestrel, she felt a familiar clarity, the cold, sharp focus that only came when the odds were long and the stakes were life and death. Par 5, intervention. Eva stepped into the command post, a quiet shadow entering a room electric with panic. The contrast was so stark that for a moment, the frantic activity seemed to slow. All eyes turned to her, the disgraced logistics captain in the torn jacket, a bizarrely calm figure in the heart of the storm. Colonel Madsen saw her and scowled, his frustration finding an easy target. "What do you want, Rostova? This is not a supply issue. Get out of my CP." She didn't flinch. She ignored him completely, her gaze fixed on the main spectrum analyzer, where a solid, unwavering block of interference obliterated the usual spikes and troughs of radio traffic. Her eyes then moved to Corporal Jean, who was sweating over a secondary console, trying to isolate a carrier wave within the noise. "Jean," she said, her voice cutting through the din. It wasn't a request. It was a quiet command. "Give me the raw data feed from the primary array. And I need the base's old signal triangulation software, the one they replaced last year. It's better at processing ghost signals from terrain bounce." Jean stared at her wide-eyed. He didn't know how she knew about the old software, which was buried 3 levels deep in the server's archives. But the authority in her voice was undeniable. He nodded, his fingers flying across his keyboard. Madsen started to object again, but Captain Rourke, the comms officer, held up a hand. "Sir, let her try. We've got nothing." Madsen clamped his jaw shut, his face a thundercloud of resentment. He crossed his arms, ready to watch her fail. Eva took Jin's seat. Her hands moved over the keyboard with a speed and precision that was mesmerizing. She wasn't just typing. She was conducting an orchestra of data. Instead of trying to fight the jamming signal head-on, she focused on its echoes, the minute distortions and reflections caused by the signal bouncing off the surrounding mountain peaks. The new software automatically filtered these out as noise. The old software, the one she'd asked for, allowed her to amplify them. She pulled up a topographical map on a split screen, her mind overlaying the signal data onto the physical terrain she had already committed to memory. "The enemy is using a phased array to mask their location," she murmured, more to herself than anyone else. "But they can't hide the physics." A web of intersecting lines began to form on the map, each one representing a reflected signal path. The room fell silent. The shouting stopped. Everyone, Madsen, Rourke, the harried specialists, gathered behind her, watching the screen. It was like watching a master cartographer charting an invisible continent. Her fingers danced, isolating and discarding false positives, cross-referencing signal strength with atmospheric density. The web of lines resolved into 3 distinct points of origin. "There," she said, pointing a finger at the screen. "They're using 3 mobile emitters to create the blanket effect. But the primary command signal for the jammers is originating from here." Her finger tapped a specific set of coordinates high on a treacherous, windswept ridge to the northeast. "And these 2 are secondary relays." She stood up, her work done. The entire process had taken less than 5 minutes. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't boasted, hadn't even looked at Madsen for approval. She had simply stated a fact, solving a problem that had paralyzed the entire command staff. In the stunned silence that followed, the only sound was the quiet hum of the computer and the ceaseless howl of the wind outside. Part 6. The Shift. The air in the command post was thick with a new kind of tension. The frantic energy of panic had been replaced by the stunned silence of disbelief. Colonel Madsen stared at the coordinates on the screen, his mind struggling to reconcile the image of the quiet, disgraced logistics captain with the tactical genius who had just dissected a complex electronic attack in minutes. A drone. Madsen finally choked out, finding his voice. Get a drone to those coordinates. Now, an operator scrambled to comply, launching one of the base's small reconnaissance drones. They watched on a monitor as the craft climbed, battling the fierce winds. The feed was grainy, but as it approached the ridge Rostova had indicated, the image resolved. Tucked into a rocky crevice, perfectly camouflaged with netting that blended into the terrain, was a small, vehicle-mounted antenna array, the primary jammer. A collective gasp went through the room. She was right. It's armed, the drone operator said, his voice tight. I see 2 hostiles, maybe 3. Target it, Madsen ordered. Take it out with a Hellfire. But before the operator could lock the missile, the drone's camera feed erupted in a flash of static and went black. A thin trail of smoke was briefly visible on the monitor of a secondary drone before it too was gone. They shot it down. Rourke breathed. They have anti-air capability. They knew we were looking. The victory of locating the jammer soured into a new, more immediate fear. The enemy wasn't just sophisticated, they were prepared. They had anticipated the response. Madsen began barking orders again, his confidence returning now that he had a physical target. I want a quick reaction force ready to move out. 2 platoons. We'll approach from the south, use the lower valley for cover. It was a textbook solution, a solid, by-the-book plan, and it was completely wrong. Eva, who had stepped back from the console and was watching the map, spoke again. Her voice was still quiet, but it now carried an immense weight. Sir, that will take too long. They'll be gone before your platoons get halfway up the mountain. The jamming isn't the attack. It's the prelude. It's designed to isolate us and to draw our forces out into a predictable, channelized assault. The main attack will come from the opposite direction, while our QRF is bogged down in the valley. Every officer in the room turned to look at her. The snickering lieutenants who had mocked her jacket now stared with a mixture of awe and unease. Major Davies, who had condescendingly explained inventory management to her, looked like he'd seen a ghost. They were all beginning to understand that they were not in the presence of a failed officer. They were in the presence of something else entirely. Colonel Madsen's face was a war of emotions. His pride, his adherence to protocol, his entire worldview was being challenged by this quiet woman in a torn jacket. To follow his own plan would be safe, predictable. To listen to her would be to admit his own inadequacy, to cede control to this inexplicable subordinate. But as he looked at the cold, hard logic on the map and then at the absolute certainty in her eyes, he felt a knot of doubt tighten in his gut. For the first time in his career, he didn't know what to do. The shift was complete. Eva Rostova was no longer an object of pity or scorn. She was an enigma, and quite possibly, their only hope. Part 7. The Second Test. The first mortar round landed with a deafening crump, 50 meters short of the western perimeter wall, showering the area with rock and shrapnel. A second followed, then a third, walking the impacts closer to the fence. The attack had begun, just as she predicted, and it came, not from the northeast where the jammer was, but from the northwest, directly through the sensor grid's blind spot she had identified on her first day. Chaos erupted anew. Alarms blared. Men scrambled for cover. The command post, which had just regained a semblance of order, was once again a hive of frantic, shouted reports. Mortars impacting on the west side, taking heavy fire. Movement spotted in the dead zone. Multiple hostiles. Madsen was frozen, caught between his own doctrine and Rostova's chillingly accurate prophecy. His plan to send 2 platoons on a long flanking march to the northeast now looked like a suicidal blunder. The enemy was already at the gates. Rostova didn't wait for him to make a decision. The time for discussion was over. She turned and walked out of the command post, moving against the tide of panicked soldiers. Her steps were calm, deliberate, a straight line through the chaos. She went directly to the armory. The supplies sergeant there, a grizzled master sergeant named Cobb, looked up startled. "Captain, we're on lockdown." "Open it," she said. It wasn't a request. Something in her eyes made him obey without question. Inside, she bypassed the standard issue M4 rifles and racks of infantry gear. Her movements were precise, targeted. She grabbed a honeycombed, ultra-lightweight chest rig. She took a suppressed MCX rifle, its short barrel perfect for close-quarters work. She selected 3 smoke grenades, 2 fragmentation grenades, and a personal radio she knew operated on a short range, encrypted frequency that local jammers wouldn't even detect. She found the mislabeled crate of advanced thermal optics, took one out, and mounted it on her rifle with practiced ease. As she geared up, a small group of soldiers gathered at the armory door, drawn by the quiet intensity of her actions. Among them was Corporal Jean, who had followed her from the CP, his face pale but resolute. There were 3 others, young privates who looked terrified but were unwilling to stand by and do nothing. "I need 3 volunteers," Rostova said, her voice never rising above a conversational tone as she slotted a magazine into her rifle. "We are not going to fight the main assault. We're going to cut off its head." Jean stepped forward immediately. "I'm with you, ma'am." The 3 privates looked at each other, then at her, and nodded, taking their own hesitant steps forward. She looked them over, her gaze quick and appraising. "Good. Jean, you're on comms. You too," she pointed to the sturdiest-looking privates. "You're on security. You," she pointed to the last one. "You're carrying extra demo." She handed him 2 blocks of the C4 from the crate she'd noted days earlier. She gave them simple, direct instructions. "We move fast and we move quiet. We stick to the shadows. We do not engage the primary assault force. Our only targets are the mortar crews and the jamming emitter. We take them out, and this whole attack falls apart." "Understood." They all nodded, their fear being replaced by a fragile sense of purpose. They were no longer cowering from an unseen enemy. They were part of a mission. Led by Rostova, the small team slipped out of a rear maintenance hatch, melting into the dust and smoke that now choked the base. She moved with a liquid grace that defied the cumbersome weight of her gear, using the very chaos of the attack as cover. The mortar explosions, the rattle of machine gun fire, the shouts of men, it was all just noise, a backdrop for the silent, deadly work she was about to do. She wasn't a logistics officer anymore. She was an operator, and she was going hunting. Part 8. The Reveal. While Rostova and her small team navigated the treacherous terrain outside the wire, a miracle occurred inside the command post. Through a momentary flicker in the jamming, perhaps as the enemy recalibrated their equipment, a sliver of a signal got through. A high-priority, encrypted data burst from CENTCOM, just a few seconds long, but it was enough. Corporal Jin's abandoned console beeped urgently. Captain Rourke, seeing the incoming message, dove for the keyboard. "I've got something." "It's a flash message from SOCOM. For the Colonel." Madsen hurried over, peering at the screen as Rourke decrypted the message. It was garbled, fragmented, but a few key phrases were clear. "Aegis Protocol. Rostova, Eva. Confirm status." "Aegis Protocol?" Madsen muttered. He'd only heard rumors. A deep black designation for operatives, so secret they were officially listed as deceased or discharged. What the hell does that mean? As Rourke worked to clean up the signal, the audio component of the message crackled to life. A man's voice, strained and urgent, filled the command post. "Colonel Madsen, this is General Peterson at Special Operations Command. We have reason to believe your facility is the target of a Spetsnaz advisory team. Repeat. You are facing Tier 1 opposition. I need a status report on your assets. Is Spectre operational?" The name hung in the air, alien and confusing. Madsen shook his head. "Spectre? We have no one by that call sign here." "Who is Spectre?" There was a pause on the other end, filled with the hiss of static. Then the general's voice came back, laced with disbelief and a terrifying urgency. Colonel, your new logistics officer, Captain Eva Rostova. Her call sign is Spectre. She was the operational commander of Task Force 11. Her file was declassified 30 minutes ago under the Aegis Emergency Protocol. You are the most decorated ghost operative of the last decade, managing your damned inventory. Now, I ask you again, what is your status? The connection died, plunging the room back into electronic silence. But the general's words echoed, landing with the force of a physical blow. Spectre, Task Force 11. The name meant nothing to the lieutenants, but the older officers and NCOs in the room felt a chill run down their spines. Task Force 11 wasn't just an elite unit. It was a myth, a whisper. The unofficial, unacknowledged team of ghosts sent to the darkest corners of the world to solve problems no one else could. They were assassins, saboteurs, and rescuers, their successes buried under layers of classification, their failures never spoken of. Their commander was a legend known only by their call sign, Spectre. Suddenly, everything about Rostova snapped into sharp, terrifying focus. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was discipline. Her observation wasn't aimlessness, it was threat assessment. Her efficiency wasn't just competence, it was the ingrained habit of a predator. In her ripped jacket, the symbol of their mockery, Madsen felt a wave of nausea. It wasn't a mark of carelessness from a desk jockey. It was a scar from a battlefield he couldn't even imagine, worn by a soldier whose boots he wasn't worthy to shine. The woman they had dismissed, insulted, and relegated to counting boxes was, in fact, a living weapon. And she was currently outside the wire, leading a handful of green recruits against a team of Russian special forces. The mockery had died, replaced by a cold, sickening dread. Part 9. Respect. The battle for FOB Kestrel turned on a whisper and a flash. Rostova's team, moving like wraiths through the swirling dust and smoke, used the terrain and the chaos of the main assault as their shield. She led them on a circuitous route, circling wide around the firefight at the western gate, approaching the mortar positions from their unguarded rear flank on the high ground. The mortar crew, 3 men, were focused on their work, confidently dropping rounds into their tube, assuming the assault force had the base's full attention. They never heard her approach. Rostova took out the first with 2 suppressed rounds to the chest. The 2 privates with her, their fear now honed into a sharp edge by her calm command, eliminated the other 2 a second later. The deadly rain of explosives on the base ceased as abruptly as it had begun. Without pausing, she pushed them forward toward the coordinates of the primary jammer. The 2 guards that were elite soldiers, alert and wary. But they were expecting an attack from the direction of the base, not from the darkness at their backs. Rostova and her team were on them before they could even raise their weapons. The fight was brutal, silent, and lasted less than 10 seconds. With the guards down, Rostova personally placed the C4 charges on the jammer's power unit. She set a 30-second timer. "Move," she ordered, and her team melted back into the rocks. The explosion was not large, but it was precise. It ripped through the delicate electronics of the jammer, and in the command post, the world came roaring back to life. The static on the radios vanished, replaced by the clear, calm voice of an AWACS controller. The satellite feed flickered on, showing friendly air assets already en route. Without their mortar support and their electronic warfare advantage, the insurgent assault on the gate faltered. Caught between the base's now coordinated machine gun fire and the impending threat from the sky, the attackers broke and fled into the night. The battle was over. As the first light of dawn painted the mountain peaks in shades of gray and pink, Rostova led her small, exhausted team back toward the base. They were covered in grime, their uniforms torn, but they walked with a new confidence. They had faced the beast and, against all odds, had won. She didn't take them through the main gate. She brought them in through the maintenance hatch they had left, avoiding any celebration or fanfare. Her final order to them was simple: get to the infirmary, get checked out, then get some rest. You earned it. She walked alone to the command post. The door was open. The room was crowded with senior officers and NCOs, their faces haggard from the long night. As she stepped inside, a profound silence fell over the room. All conversation stopped. Every eye was on her. Colonel Madsen stood in the center of the room. He looked at her, at the suppressed rifle held at a low ready, at the dust on her face, at the calm, unreadable expression in her eyes. The shame and awe on his face were palpable. He didn't speak. Words were inadequate. He drew himself up to his full height, his back ramrod straight, and rendered the slowest, most deliberate salute of his entire career. It was more than a gesture of military courtesy. It was an apology. It was an act of supplication. It was a profound, unconditional admission of respect. One by one, every other officer in the room followed his lead. Captain Rourke, Major Davies, the snickering lieutenants. They all raised their hands to their brows, their salutes a silent, unified chorus of atonement. Eva Rostova, Spectre, stood in the center of their circle, a quiet storm of competence, and simply nodded, acknowledging their gesture before lowering her weapon. The war was over, both outside the wire and within. Part 10. Closure. 3 days later, a sleek black MH-60 Black Hawk helicopter sat on the landing pad, its rotors spinning in a lazy, powerful arc that whipped dust across the tarmac. It bore no markings, no insignia, nothing to identify its unit or origin. It was as anonymous and purposeful as the woman walking toward it. Eva Rostova was leaving FOB Kestrel. She was no longer wearing the tattered olive jacket or the standard-issue camouflage of the base. She was dressed in sterile black tactical gear, the kind worn by people who moved between worlds without leaving a trace. There was no rank on her collar, no name tag on her chest. The logistics officer was gone. Spectre was back. As she crossed the short distance to the helicopter, her path intersected with Corporal Jins. He was on his way to the comms tent, but he stopped, standing a little straighter as she approached. He didn't salute. That would have been too formal, too public for the moment. Instead, he gave her a short, sharp nod of profound respect, a silent acknowledgement from one quiet professional to another. Eva paused for a fraction of a second, her stride unbroken. She met his gaze and returned the nod. It was a small gesture, almost imperceptible, but it was a bridge of understanding built in the crucible of combat. It was the only farewell she needed. She boarded the helicopter without a backward glance. The crew chief slid the door shut, and the aircraft lifted off, its engine noise swelling to a roar before it banked sharply and disappeared over the mountain ridges, leaving only a swirling cloud of dust in its wake. From his office window, Colonel Madsen watched it go. He had not spoken to her since the salute in the command post. There was nothing left to say. He had offered her a formal commendation, a medal. She had refused, not with words, but with a simple, dismissive shake of her head. Her actions were her only statement. Later that day, a private assigned to clean out her vacated quarters found a single item left behind. On the neatly made cot, folded with military precision, was the worn, olive drab jacket. The jagged tear on the sleeve was stark and clear. The private, who had heard the stories now circulating in hushed, reverent tones throughout the base, knew what he was looking at. It wasn't just a piece of clothing. It was a relic, a symbol of their ignorance and of the quiet, unassuming lethality they had so foolishly mocked. He picked it up gently, as if handling something sacred, and stood in the silent, empty room, the weight of its story heavy in his hands.